Well, I was born here in Two Rivers on the east side. I lived there till I was married at 21, and it was on the corner of Jackson and 19th. So behind us was Roger Street. And at that time, there were, and there still are, only two homes. One of them is burnt now. They had a fire last fall, I think. And the other one, that's where that boy, the Canyo, that wrote the book, that's where he grew up, back there on Roger Street. And then maybe for not his whole life, he went and moved. They moved to another house after that. But my grandmother lived right down the block, and she had, I think, 16 children. And quite a few of them were in our neighborhood. Like there were two, my father's fishing partner and these Ganyus on Roger Street. And we lived on Jackson, and Pashek's, she was a Taddy, was on the middle of the block. My grandma lived down the block. My uncle lived a little bit further. You know, it was, and my aunt lived a block away toward the east on Emmett Street. So I don't know why they all stayed in one place, but my grandparents had a farm out on, it's called Viceroy Road now. And there's a schoolhouse that was right next to it where all the kids went to school. And now Roman Patriot owns it. It's a home. But anyway, evidently my parents had got either a grant of land or bought a large amount of land when he came here from Germany. And my father was born here. So, and he's one of the older ones, so I'm pretty sure that there were maybe two children when he came from Germany. And his wife her name was Mary Palm. And I imagine she came she must have, because if they already had a child or two. So they must have got this big amount of land. And of that, my father owned 100 acres near Point Beach State Forest. And we called it our farm. We went out there every Sunday in the summer. My mother cooked on a big old wood stove, and we'd have our dinner there, and then we'd either pick the wild, whatever the berries were, strawberries, raspberries, blackberries, whatever was in season. And my father had this big field that he would cultivate. He had a horse that he kept out there in a little barn, and then in the winter, the farmers that were next door took care of it for him. But they used him once it was a babe, her name was, great big horse. And I can remember my father putting me on her when I was real little. I don't remember much, but that I can remember. And she was probably hauling logs out of the woods and fell, and her leg was broken. So they had to shoot her. Well, for years, my father would either borrow a tractor or do it himself, because we planted big fields of potatoes, corn, squash, and we even planted beans for the canning company. And anyway, the first thing he bought when he didn't have any more children to support was a tractor, a John Deere. He just loved that tractor. And I was going through my parents' the settled things of their estate, and it said this tractor was worth $500 at the time. So it must have been in pretty good condition. But I think my brother bought it. But anyway, that was his pride and joy. And my son-in-law is the same way. He's got his own tractor now. And it's something that men like to do. I guess it's their toys. But I was born in town, and there were 7 of us in the family. My mother and father were in their 30s when they were married. And I was born when my mother was 42. And then she had another boy, my youngest brother, at 45. And I was born in the living room there. And the only reason I know the time is because my older sister, who is 7 years older than I am, said that when she went to school in the morning, the bed was out in the living room. And that was a good sign. And when she came home for lunch at noon, I was there. So that's how that happened. And I went on to have 12, and I had one at 41. That was my last one. In 20 years, I had 12 children. And I once asked my mother, how come everyone else in the family is 18 months apart? Exactly. And between Cyril and I, there's 3 years. She said, oh, I had a miscarriage. Didn't mean anything in those days. She used to tell me that when her mother lost a baby, they just put the clothes away under the bed, the baby clothes, and that was it. They expected that to happen. But see, I've never even been close to a miscarriage. I just was lucky, I guess. But the shed, like I said, was right below, across from Roger Street, right on the river. And my father had an open boat, which is called a pondet boat. And he fished with his brother Bill, who lived right down the street. And they fished that way together until their boys were old enough to take over and help. And then my Uncle Bill took off and bought a gillnet boat and started gillnet fishing, which they fish year-round, whereas the pondets only fished in the summer. And my father would somehow save enough money all summer to live on in the winter. And then he would either find a job at Miro, it was called the Aluminum Goods then, or he'd work for somebody else somewhere. And then he also made wood out at our land for our own heat. We had a wood stove in the kitchen and a furnace in a basement that could take the wood. So he finally got to the point where one year they had only $100 saved to last all winter. And they made it go because we had a garden, we had a cow in town, we had chickens, our own eggs, a calf every so often. So we managed, but it was very hard. And the next year was no better. So they decided it was time to go on welfare. And for those winter months, we were on welfare. And a nurse used to come around, her name was Katie Nash, and she was the city nurse. And she would come around to the families that were on welfare, I guess there were a lot of us, and ask, what do you need? And at Christmas time, what kind of toy would we like for Christmas? And I remember getting a new quilt, and someone got a new mattress, someone in the family. And when she came at Christmas time, I said, all I wanted, pardon my French, a nigger doll. I wanted, we didn't have any black people in town at all. Now I have 2 black son-in-laws. But that was what I wanted, a nigger doll. And she went all over Manitowoc and Two Rivers, could not find one. So she brought me a box about this long, this wide. It was called The Wedding of the Dolls. And there were a bride and a groom and attendants and a preacher and a church and a little flower girl. And I was thrilled to pieces. But at the same time, my brother was out of high school, and he was working at, it was called the City News Depot downtown, about where Delabru Jewelers is. And he was working there, and I had to go bring him lunch one day. And I saw this doll sitting up on the top shelf, and it was that kind of bisque stuff, that cracked real easily. But here was this doll with a little diaper on and 3 pigtails with ribbons on. And I ran home and I told my mother, they've got a nigger doll. They got one at Ray's store. And she said, how much was it? I said, $0.25. Well, she was only too happy to give me the $0.25, and I had that doll for years. But in our dining room, we had a couch that was leather, and it could fold back to make a bed. But the toys were kept underneath. And so somebody opened it one day and broke the doll's head. So I lost my nigger doll. But, I was always fascinated with that. And one time when I went as a chaperone with my kids to Milwaukee to a Brewer game, this was Catholic Knights Insurance Group. And these kids stood up in the bus and pointed at all the black people that were waiting for the bus. And I was so embarrassed. I don't even remember if this was the time when they had a ride in the back of the bus. I kind of think it was. But anyway, I was so embarrassed that they were doing that, and I gave them a real good lecture. And then about that time, we were notified that if we wanted to host some children from the inner, whatever it was called in Milwaukee, why we could have them like for a week or 2 weeks or whatever, and they would come on a bus. So the first year we got a girl named Jeannie and a boy, I forgot who he was, but his father was a policeman, and he was Catholic too, which was a little different for us to have anybody strange come. And the little girl was running down our driveway, which was just cinders and stones, and she fell and scratched her knee, and it was bleeding. And one of my kids brought her in the house. Mama, Jeannie's got red blood just like I do. You know, this is how new this was. And they had no problem with it. We just never did. And the next year, I think we had a girl, and her little sister was staying by somebody else's house. And she was supposed to see to it that her little sister got on the bus. Well, for some reason, we got stopped by a train going to the train station in Manitowoc, and we missed the train. And this little girl just cried and cried because she was responsible for her sister who was on that train. And I don't know who was in charge that they didn't realize our girl wasn't there. But anyway, that night she went to bed, which is the first time anyone had ever had an accident even. But next day her parents came and got her. And we had her for 2 years in a row, and that same boy, I forgot what his name is, for 2 years in a row. And then we had other children too. But it was such a good experience for my kids, because none of them are prejudiced. As you can see, 2 of my girls are married to black men. And they are the nicest gentlemen. One of them calls me gorgeous. So I have to call him handsome. He's as black as anybody could be, because his father, I think, grew up in the Dominican Republic, and he came to America, and somehow he married a black woman too, but he didn't marry her. That's what it was. He just left her, and she had sickle cell anemia and died when he was only 5 or 6 years old. So his father married again. The stepfather had adopted him, and he married again, and then he had a black mother again, but she was real strict, and she taught him everything. He takes your plates before you're done eating to go and wash them, and he vacuums every day, and he presses all his clothes. So, I mean, that's the kind of a guy he is. And they were both in the Army. They were buddies in the Army, my 2 son-in-laws. And my daughter had been married to somebody here from Two Rivers that she went to college with in Green Bay. And they were married before she ever graduated from college. And about a year and a half later, he just left her. She was making, she's a software engineer. And he had taken political science, and he wasn't finding a job in his field. And he's working in a bank, and I kind of think he just resented the fact that she made twice the salary he did. But she wasn't that way. It's just, he started going out, he said, playing golf with his boss, but it was a girl. And finally, Julie knew about it and told him, she said, this isn't going to work. Oh, he was very glad to get out of the marriage, and so she said, I'm never getting married again. She was so hurt. She had the white dress and the veil and everything, you know. She felt so bad. And I kept telling her to get an annulment. I said, it wasn't your fault. He walked out on you. And I said, get an annulment. She says, I'm never getting married again. I said, you might want to someday. So she finally did get it. And here this buddy of my other son-in-laws, they've been married 30 years already. He was always over at their house, and she was working in North Carolina, and they were stationed in North Carolina. So she said, what the heck are we doing running around single? We know each other so well. So they've been married, maybe 15 years. And I'm just as proud of all of them. They're all nice. They're good kids. My son is the one who plays Santa all the time. Hasn't got a decent job, but he loves being a Santa. And he does reenacting for the War of 1812. French and Indian War, I take that back. And he knows a lot of French and things. I mean, you know, everyone's got their own little thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I have 3 college graduates and 2 that went to LTC and 1 that's a beautician. And 1 spent 6 years in the Army and, you know, 12 kids. 1 girl died. It's going to be 9 years in August. She had an epileptic seizure in her sleep. And just, doctors said she didn't suffer at all. But as our family goes, next Sunday we're celebrating her 50th birthday by going to church in Manitowoc, and we're all going out for breakfast. Yeah, we do stuff like that. So, I went to high school, Two Rivers. I worked at Hamilton's for 3 years before I got married. I worked on the dryer line when I had been in the office, but I knew I couldn't get married on $16 a week, so I asked if I could go in the factory, and I did, and I was like an inspector at the end of the line. And they ran out of steel. This was right after the war, so they put us in the office, and I worked there until I started to show. Of course, they didn't let you work then, so I quit, and I didn't go back to full-time work for, oh gosh, I worked in an ice cream parlor for about 2 weeks, but I had such a crabby baby, my second one, that my sister-in-law just refused to babysit. So I did work. I had my second last child. She was 6 weeks old, and a friend of mine recommended me to, do you know Machut Supper Club?
Mm-hmm.
Well, a friend of mine was working there, and I said to her, you know, I always wanted to be a waitress. And she said, hey, I know somebody who's looking for help. So Babe called me right away. She said, can you start Sunday? And I said, yeah, but I don't have a uniform or anything. And she said, just come as you are. Don't worry about that. She said, you see if you like it or not. And I went, no. I just hung up, and all of a sudden I was still nursing my baby. She was 6 weeks old. So I called Babe back, and I said, I don't think I can start until she's weaned anyway. She said, don't let that bother you. I nursed all of my kids. She said, you can go home in the afternoon, because we only work Saturdays and Sundays then. So Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. So if I had to work all day, I went home at noon and came back at 2. And she was very understanding. So then I had another baby 3 years later, and we did the same thing. So after that, I only worked half days. I couldn't really let my husband take care of those babies. I just love newborns, and I never had, beside that second one that was so crabby, the others were all really good babies. I mean, I put them to bed, they slept all night after 6 weeks. And I know so many, my grandkids, my gosh, they're up, you know, all night long and sleeping with the parents because they won't sleep in the crib. And I don't know, I guess out of necessity. And I always tell everyone too, I never had menopause. I didn't have time. I had my last one at 41, and I didn't really have time to be sick, and I never really did. No. So anyway, I think it was a pretty nice life. My husband went from one job to another, trying to get better. He worked at Hamilton's, and then he went to a dairy, Fishel's Dairy, for a while. And then there was a man in Casey's with him who had a dairy in Two Rivers. He said, you're working at a dairy, why don't you come work for me? And it was just through the lot of our house. So he went to work for the city, Two Rivers Dairy, and it became Verifine after that. He worked there till he just couldn't jump in and out of the truck anymore. His knees were too bad. So he sold it to my son-in-law, who also had a route, and that was my oldest son-in-law. And he went to work for Shopko. First he worked for St. Luke's as a janitor. And then when Shopko opened, he got the job there as a janitor. So he worked nights, and there were many advantages to working there because we had insurance as usual. I never had a bill for any one of my children because we always had insurance. It was really nice. Even the oldest one was operated when she was 6 weeks old, and they didn't insure babies before 6 weeks at that time, and so, but they did. She was just old enough, and she had it's called pyloric stenosis, projectile vomiting, and it's the cord between the stomach and the intestines, and that tightens up. And they tried everything on her, different kinds of formulas, and they didn't tell me to pump my milk and bring it out. They weren't frowning on breast milk at that time. And finally, they had to operate on her, and she's got a scar like this long. But the next one, now I had 2 children 10 months apart, because this one was, I quit nursing her, of course, when she went in the hospital. And the next one came a month early. So here I am with 2 babies that weren't walking yet. And we lived upstairs. But I don't look back at it as a trial, because I just love those kids. And my husband and I got along very well. And so anyway, I managed. And after that, I discovered the minute I stopped nursing, I'd get pregnant. And we didn't have birth control. What we did have, my sister had I don't know if I should tell this. She had very bad periods, so they put her on birth control pills. She promptly got a blood clot, and she was hospitalized. So my doctor knew very well I could not go on those. Well, okay. It just happens, and I enjoyed every one of my children. I really did, and they're a big blessing now. The one that's in Texas pays for my internet, and for Christmas, my children gave me a laptop, which I had web TV before, and that's no problem. I learned to do everything on there. They thought Mom should graduate to a laptop. Well, it's like Greek. So I signed up for the class that got here. I didn't think of it sooner, but the dean showed me where there's a class going to be, I think, in the 22nd of March. Mm-hmm. So I am going to figure out. And my grandkids come over and show me, but they work so darn fast. And then they say, well, see, you just push that, the mouse is in a little pad. It's not a mouse that you turn around. And it's not hard to operate. But I didn't even know that if I wanted to get the picture centered, I should push it this way or this way. Nobody told me that. The kids just did it, you know. Well, one of them is 19. These are my youngest grandkids, and the other one is 16. And she's still at Roncalli, and he goes to LTC. So they don't really have a lot of time, and she plays hockey with the hockey team in Manitowoc. And she's a goalie. And the cutest little thing she is, she's a goalie. She just spent 6 months in Australia as an exchange student. Wow. She, the family she lived with, the father had been my son-in-law's family's exchange student years ago. He was from Brazil, and they kept in touch all these years. So now they had a girl the same age as their younger girl, and so their daughter stayed here for 6 months, and then Mary went back with her Janella went back with her to Australia. And then at Christmas time, when her semester of 6 months was up, then her parents, my daughter and her husband and the son, flew to Australia and stayed there for 2 weeks and brought her back home. So she went right back. She's going to be a senior at Roncalli next year. And most of my kids went to Roncalli too. They mostly paid their own tuition. I always told them when I was in high school, I paid all my fees because my parents couldn't afford anything extra. I bought my own class ring. I bought the yearbook, all those kind of things, because I babysat a couple nights a week. And I didn't really, I wasn't too dependent on them, but I lived there till I was married and managed to save about $50 to get married on. And we had a reception at the community house.
Really?
Yeah. Were you here when before they remodeled it? No. Well, that room that is now the Beringer room was part of the banquet room, and it had a kitchen at the end of it. So that's where I had my wedding. And I had one of my classmates had a band, and he played. It was a fairly cheap wedding.
Well, there you go.
And I borrowed my sister-in-law's dress. So she offered it to me, and I'm not that way. Now, when my kids got married, they made all their own dresses. And the ones that don't sew, one of my daughters has a seamstress in Manitowoc, the shop, and she made the dresses of those that don't sew, because this brain of mine, Julie, she can't sew on a button, but everybody else in the family sews, and they make their own things plus their kids' things, and they sew for people. So one girl, my oldest one, went to college to be a teacher, and she lasted about 2 years, and she just didn't like teaching anymore. So she worked at a library, and anyway, now she's sewing again, works for a dry cleaners in Manitowoc.
Okay. That's really good, life history kind of thing. But I know you have stories about, like, the families with the fishing a little bit more. I'd like to get some more of that. And I didn't get on the camera before about the picture. If you want to bring that picture out again and re-explain it.
Okay.
And I'm going to just
back
up a little bit. No, back up a little bit so I can get the picture. Lift it up a little bit higher. There you go. Maybe a little bit more. There you go.
Okay. Well, this was taken in the doorway to the shed where my father and his brother fished out of. And it was at the very beginning of Roger Street. That's where it starts. And 19th is the street that goes a long way. This was my father's brother, partner. And this one is a Monka. We don't know what he was. And back here is Julius Felice, who was a cousin of my father's, and this is my father. Now, I don't know who this guy is over here. Maybe this is the Felice, but anyway, this sturgeon wasn't something they usually fished. And contrary to public opinion, we've heard that at that time the fishermen caught these things and stacked them up on the beach like cordwood. Oh, when you think about fish, how slippery they are, they would have been laying flat, wouldn't they? So, no, and Cyril, my brother, who this picture belongs to him and his wife, he said it couldn't be, that wasn't true at all, but that's what they used to say, that the fishermen caught them but didn't use them. And I wondered now, what do they do with those big sturgeon that they catch on Lake Winnebago and all over? And I've heard they actually eat them. And if they're going to mount them, I don't know what they did with this one, I would like to know. They just use the skin anyway, and they say that now some of those fish are 100 years old when they catch them, but they don't get tough like maybe it's the water. I don't know. So that's the story. That's about all that I have of the fishing life. They had a boat tied right at the dock down there, and they went out early in the morning. But they were always home by noon, and they would clean fish all the way home. Well, if they usually came home before noon, and we could tell when their boat was coming in. Every fisherman's wife recognized their husband's motors, and he'd come in. My mother would say, "Get ready, we're going to have to clean fish." If this was a Friday, I'd go down and he'd give me a whole batch of perch, and my mother and I would clean them, and then I would deliver them to her great aunts who lived up on the north end. Of course, we walked everywhere. And I had 3 of them that I would deliver fish to. And once in a while, one of them would give me a piece of hard candy from Christmas yet that was stuck in the jar. But I also would go shopping for one of them. She lived across from what was the Polish school on Washington Street. Now it's the drugstore. Well, she lived in there, and she didn't even have plumbing in the house. And I don't know how they let her do this, but this was back in the 30s. And she had an outdoor toilet, and she had, the basement was ground, you know, and the attic wasn't finished off. She had been married a short time, and she had 1 daughter who committed suicide. And her husband was, evidently, he wasn't crazy, but maybe he was schizophrenic. He'd be perfectly normal for a while, and he'd be in this place in Oshkosh, and then he'd decide he was okay, and he'd go. And he'd go and buy a farm someplace and all kinds of stuff like that, and then they'd put him back in. So he came and went, and he finally died there. So she's living as a widow in this house, and she would send me upstairs to this attic and to get some toy that her daughter had had. And so she'd give me, I had a little, like it was a doctor's satchel. I had a chest of drawers, a cradle, a little stroller, little metal stroller, all things that her daughter had had. So those were very precious to me. But you know, I let my kids wear them out. I don't have them anymore. So from her, I had another aunt that lived down on Adams Street, I think, and they were also old and didn't have children, so no car. So I'd bring them fish, and it was my Friday job. That's all. And of course, we had to clean enough for us too. And we may have eaten fish 3-4 times a week, and I still love them. I like fish, yeah. So, when, like I said, when my uncle took over a gillnet rig, then my father tried to do it alone, and it didn't last long at all. So I don't know an awful lot about how the other fishermen lived, except that next door to us was Everett LaFawn, who they called him Butch, and he was a state senator, but he also had a fish rig about a block away, and no telephones. His daughter and I were buddies, so we would run down and give her dad a message back and forth. And one day I was running and not looking, and I fell and broke my collarbone. Well, I just cried and cried. It hurt. Well, my mother said, "Oh, you know, we'll see how it is." But I didn't sleep all night, and so the next morning they took me to the doctor, who was upstairs in Schrader's store at that time.
Yes.
And I had a broken collarbone. So anyway, we played a lot down at the fish sheds because my father didn't have reels, but they did, because their nets went on reels to dry.
Okay.
My father's nets stayed out all summer long. They were attached to some big poles, which he had a big, we called it a scow. It was a big, flat, moving boat that didn't have sides on, but it had a hole in the front like this, where the engine just pounded these big poles into the lake. And of course they were set close to land, not like the gill nets were out further, because they didn't have to have something to attach them. These pond nets had to be attached to something. So in the spring they would go out, and you know, from town you could hear that. It would just like whoosh and then a pounding. And you could hear that when every time it hit it, and it would echo in the woods. And I can hear those sounds just like, you know, like the sound of the seagulls. They're just the gulls, I'm sorry. I learned that at Woodland Dunes. Anyway, then in the fall, when they were through fishing, they had to pull them out again, and they used this same scow. And if you've ever seen a picture, there's quite a few of them around town and some at the fishing village, of the fishing fleet in, I don't know if it says 1974 or whatever, but there's a date at the bottom, and it's taken facing the Coast Guard station.
Okay.
And there's a whole bunch of fish tugs in there, and way out toward the pier is this scow. of ours that they must have been, they pulled it in and out, and then when they were through with it, it came up on dry land all summer long. And it was a place to play, and all the big piles, they were from my father's woods. We called them piles because they were perfectly straight pine trees, and they were like stripped and seasoned somehow. And then during the winter sometime, they would take these, all the pond net fishermen did this. They had to be tarred so that they would withstand the lake. So we had this land out there, and this great big pot, I can remember it was a big tall thing on a platform. And I imagine the horse was used to pull the nets out. They were dropped in this big pot of tar, and then somehow the ropes were attached, and the horse would pull them out, and they'd spread them out on the sand, because it was all sand hills in those days. And they'd dry, and then they were rolled up and stored for the winter. So that's how they took care of their nets. Now the gillnet people had these reels, and they would, when they got their nets all reeled up on those reels and mended, that's why they did it, because they'd have to mend the holes, take all the gunk out and everything. And then they were taken off and piled in boxes with all the leads, which held the net down on one side, and all the, what did they call them? They were aluminum
buoys?
Floats. Early on, they were made of wood. Mm-hmm. But the wooden ones would get soaked after a while, and they'd have to keep replacing them. So Miro made these aluminum ones, but during the war they couldn't get the aluminum, so they made them out of plastic. But they had to boil their nets to get them clean, and that plastic would melt. So it was a problem, and whenever we found one of those floats on the beach, we'd bring it to one of those fishermen, and they'd give us a nickel for it, which was pretty nice, because my father didn't need them. So anyway, then they would store theirs that they weren't using in their sheds. And this uncle of mine had a shed about a block away from us. And they would pile all the nets up on the sides like that and cover them with burlaps. And we'd have dances in that shed. And I remember once throwing a party for my grandma's 80th birthday. And she lived just, like across the street. But it was a surprise party. All the grandkids threw this one. And there were about 80 of us, but I don't think too many were there. I just remember that she had 80-some grandchildren when she died. And so the sheds were used in the winter for fun. The guys would meet down there and have a keg of beer or something, play cards, whatever. And then every fisherman had his own ice house. And how it goes back to the fact that we had an ice company in Two Rivers that harvested ice to deliver to people who had ice boxes. We did. And my parents had one, well, it was at the end of our property, and you would preserve that ice with sawdust. So the ice was made in the river right before that other bridge, the 22nd Street Bridge. That's where the water was the deepest. Okay. And they would use these great big saws and saw a great big square and then crossways. And all the fishermen would fill that big ice house at this company. I think it was a Schultz that had this ice company. And they would help fill that one, and then they'd use all the same equipment, and each fisherman got his house, his ice house filled. And, of course, we had always had sawdust. I don't know where the rest got them, because my father made wood all winter long. And we always had ice in the summer for making ice cream or whatever. And, of course, they had to ice the fish. The fish were put in boxes that were made locally. They were very rough because they came back and were used again. And the fish were put in there and iced and then weighed. They had a great big scale. It's down there at Fishing Village now. And they would nail it shut, and then a truck would come through at night and collect all that fish, the boxes from all the fishermen, and haul them to Chicago mostly, because Milwaukee had their own fisheries, and this is just my conclusion. And they hauled them away, and then they got a check like every Monday for the fish that they delivered all that week. Now we were talking about the fish guts at that meeting that day, and I said, well, they went to the mink sheds, the mink farms, and Chester Taddy was there, and he said, oh no, they didn't, because his family lived out on the Manitowoc Road, and his father would collect those and boil that stuff and get oil that evidently he sold to somebody else. But I had forgotten that. I just knew that maybe we didn't have as much of that left as the other fishermen did. But I remember that ours went to a mink farm on the south side. And it was cheap food for them, because that's all the mink fed. So anyway, this one winter, they were making ice down there, and my father had the job of standing on the top of the platform, because the ice came up, there was an engine that moved the belt that carried the ice up to the platform, and then he would grab it and put it in the truck, and then somebody would be piling them up. And this one year, he was sick. I don't ever remember him going to a doctor or being sick, but that time he was. And so they got one of his nephews from the farm yet, and or maybe it was his younger brother. I'm not sure. I think it was his nephew, but he came up there to take his place. And there was ice on the platform, and he fell off and was killed. And he was single, probably 18 or 19 years old. And I always think of that, I hear my father had 7 children to support, and it could have been him. Because I had an aunt across down the block from us who was married to my father's brother. They were 2 sisters, married brothers. And her husband was killed in a car accident when she had 3 young children, and she had to go to work in the hospital. And she did the laundry, and I thought, after a while, how would my mother have ever supported us if he had been killed? No such thing as insurance. Well, he probably had life insurance, but that's one of the things that I really remember about the dangers that came with fishing.
Yeah.
Besides being out there in all kinds of weather, and even though it was summertime, that lake can get pretty rough. And my oldest brother, also had a boat of his own later on, and he was stuck with the motor, died. I think they talked about that down here when this boy who gave the presentation, he's a nephew of mine, he's a son of this, or grandson of this other partner. And he was talking about that time that my brother was stuck out in the middle of the lake. I guess he was pretty far south of us, almost to Kewanee, or to Sheboygan, and his engine died. And they couldn't radio, their radio wasn't working, and they couldn't get a hold of, they didn't have any distress signals. They were too far out because they had drifted, and the Coast Guard didn't see them. And he was out there all night. And then they had broken up fish boxes for heat, because they only take enough coal along for this little heater. And eventually his wife reported him. I don't know if he was alone on the boat or if he had, that I don't remember. But his wife reported him missing in the morning, and then the Coast Guard went out searching for him, and they found him. And they were none the worse for wear, but at that time, he had like a 9-month-old baby yet. That was the youngest one of his children. And I don't think that stopped him from fishing. Eventually, the fish are dying out, and now it has to be a big company. This Art Swear, who I think lives in Oconto, owns quite a few of the boats that go out now. And the Pondet fishermen are just about out. I don't think anybody fishes with an open boat anymore. But it was a living in those days, and that developed from the little other sailboats that they had until Collenberg built this engine.
Engines.
Yeah, And then, it just gradually changed. So some of those things I remember back there, but it was a rough life for everyone.
Why take fish to your aunt's on Friday?
Because we were Catholic. And Catholics don't eat meat on Friday. That was in those days.
So is that what started the Friday night fish fry?
Yes, definitely. Because this community is mostly Catholic. And it doesn't matter to anybody else. They all eat fish on Friday. It's just one of those things. I guess Milwaukee has really got that industry, that Friday night fish is a must. And I still observe it. I mean, I don't eat meat on Friday just because I'm used to that. In fact, I like fish better. There's a method to my madness. So that was a good question. Now it's time for you.
So you took the fish. You only took enough for your aunts.
Yes.
And you kept enough to feed your family.
Right.
And then he sold the rest.
Mm-hmm.
About how much do you remember him selling? Do you, like so many barrels a week? Do you remember at all how much?
I have no idea.
No.
No.
Okay.
And we would have measured them in boxes.
Boxes.
And they also measured their nets in boxes. And I can just remember the men saying, I took out 3 boxes and came back with 2. Because what they used to do, now my father kept his out all summer long, but the other fishermen would, the nets would come through the boat, a window in the boat on a big reel, which you can see at Rogers Street. And then it would go across the table and they'd pick the fish out and sort them as they picked them out. The net just kept coming and they would put it into the box very carefully with those, like I said. But the boxes that are out there now don't look like that. And they would clean fish in between going from one net to the other so that by the time they got home, a lot of their fish were cleaned. And then they had to put that net that they took in a box in the back. There's a platform in most of these sheds. Most of these boats have a big platform in the back where they pile the nets up. They take a fresh one and set it right out the back window. The 2 words that we used were lift and set. And when they set the net, then they would attach a buoy to it. And every fisherman had his own color on the buoy. So they all knew, there was no poaching or anything. People they helped each other. And if one was in distress or something, there was always another one out there to come and help them.
So he would set the net out the back of the boat.
Yes. Yes.
And the one coming in was coming in the side of the boat?
Yes. There's a big long window like this with a reel sitting right in there. And that would, there was a motor underneath to keep it going. And that would pull this net through. And then the guys would just stand there, and while that net was coming up, they had to work real fast to get these fish out of there. And once in a while you'd get an illegal one, like a pike, which we weren't supposed to catch. And pike had real long noses, and sometimes they were broken or something. And so my father would take that, put it under the boards that they walked on, and we had baked pike for dinner. But they had to be a certain size, so they were measured as they came out. If it didn't look right, they had some kind of a measurement that they had to measure the fish, throw them back. If they were dead or alive, they had to throw them back. If they were too small. Yeah.
So what kinds of fish were they catching? Perch?
Perch and whitefish. And some chubs then. Now chubs and, the little bitty skinny ones. Can't think of them. Smelt. That's about all they're catching now, smelt and chubs. And chubs make real good smoked fish, and they're rather greasy, and so are whitefish. But the perch were always perch. They were always good. And like that sturgeon, that was just a fluke. They would never have caught them in their nets. The pond nets were set with, they had a long lead of, probably longer than this room of nets. which led to what they called the pond. It was set with 4 poles, and a net was stretched between those, and it formed like a little gully in there. So when the fish didn't know how to get back out, they just were stuck. So when the fish tugs came out, they could open one side. They'd pull that open and back the boat right in, and then shovel the fish with shovels right into the boat bottom. That's what the pond net people did. That was different than the gill nets.
So how did the gill nets work?
Well, they just pull them in through the front, like I said, in through that window. And then
But how were the fish caught in the gill net? You know, the pond was a trap. The gill net was the gills.
That's
right?
why they, yeah, and that's a real fine mesh, like nylon. It was cotton in those days, but it's nylon now. And they get in there and they can't get out. So the gills catch them. And that wasn't a problem to fishermen to get them out. In fact, Chester was talking about how they would bloat up, the fish would, and the gills that would be their lungs. And they had a little a handle with a spike on, and they would just puncture that so that they would land flat in the box. And sometimes when kids would be fishing, you know, those were a little souvenir to take, that little, like a balloon, you know, that was something for them to take. And there were a lot of byproducts too, like lawyers were kind of long, snaky things. They were good to eat too, but they would have livers in that were very good, and that's a delicacy, lawyer livers. And whitefish had something called, we called them chums. Now I think it would match like a gizzard and a chicken.
Okay.
And they were kind of a hard thing, and you had to slit them open, and they were so good, just fried and, you know, on a wood stove in a big pan. And there were fish eggs too that some of the people ate. I suppose it would have been in the spring, like when they first have their eggs, and to me it matched the brains. That was another thing my father ate. And anyway, there were all those different things that were used. And then the fish in the guts thing, I don't know if you heard about that, but when I work at Roger Street, I tell the kids that there's a story that one of the men going out on the boat forgot his lunch bucket. So he had to make some dinner. So they cleaned a bunch of fish, and there was a pan about this long. It's still down there, cast iron, and it sits right on the stove. And they put all the guts in there, and they put the fish in whole, and a lot of salt. And then you just take that acts as oil, because there really is a lot of oil in them. And that would be their dinner. So they started doing that. Now, that's what I tell them. But if it started that way, I'm not sure. Or maybe it goes back further than that. I don't know. But I always figured that that's what happened. And every so often there's a party you hear somewhere, and it'll be a bunch of old fishermen that remember this, and that will be their treat. And one time, I've been living at Village Green for about 15 years, and when my youngest brother was still living, he would always go and he'd bring like the produce from his garden down to the fish sheds, and he'd trade for fish. And he would he'd always have cauliflower and cabbage and corn and, you know, truckloads full. And if he didn't have it at home, he'd go out to where it was grown, and he'd glean the fields, the corners that the tractors didn't go. Mm-hmm. And so he'd always go to the fish shed with all this stuff and trade. And so he would smoke the chubs, or he would make one of these dishes. And he once said, "Wouldn't those old people at your place like some fish in the guts?" I said, "I don't even know if they know what that is." So I put a notice on the bulletin board, and if anybody would be interested, please sign up, because then we know if he should make them or not. And I had a nice long list. They evidently knew about him. And so he made this pan of fish and brought it in down in the community room, and everybody had their fill, and they liked them. So, I mean, who's to say what's going to go?
They remembered, or they at least knew about it.
Yeah.
Wow.
So that was
So
great.
why could the gillnet people fish all winter long, but the pondnet people couldn't?
Well, because they had the protection. This was a covered ship, covered boat.
Whereas the pondnet was an open boat.
Yes, and also the gillnets had a stove in that they could, keep warm.
Keep warm.
Yeah. Even then, the pictures that I see, the men are dressed with ear laps on and slickers, raincoats on top of their jackets and stuff, because the water splashed in, when they were working.
Freezing.
It was a rough life, and still they're doing it. And I think they tell me that there are still pond nets up in Door County, because when you get close to Kewanee and Algoma, where you're by the lake, you can see those nets out there. They're that close in, because they have to be in order to drive those piles in the water.
Yeah, otherwise they're too far out. It's too deep.
Right. Oh, I forgot. I didn't know what that was. I knew I didn't have a necklace on.
Great.
So, well, the other thing that I had was when the papers where when my father bought his fish rig and stuff like that.
Oh yeah, why don't you get those out and show?
Jacob Geimer and wife to Martin Smith, and then it goes. These are old. Look at the writing on there.
This was for
the fish rig. He bought the shed and the boat and the nets. And then here's a receipt that says 3 years after date, for value received, I promise to pay to Paul Taddy and William Taddy the sum of $1,800. Part payment may be made on this note at any time before maturity, and interest to be paid only on amount received. Now, I don't understand why whoever this was, Joseph P. Gunya, was giving it to them. I have the papers where they bought the rig. Martin Smith paid $900 to this Geimer for the rig, and from there, the Geimer sold it to my father and his brother. In this 4th day of May, 1929, before a notary public within Fort said county personally appeared Louis Pulse, to be known to be the person described in and who executed the foregoing instrument, and acknowledged that he executed the same. It's all so mumbo jumbo that the fish shanties, which are situated near the southeast corner of Fractional 9, Township 20 of Range 25, re-subdivision of original blocks 17 and 18, the pond net fishing outfit of the said parties consists of boats, piles, nets, engines, and pile driver. That's what it was called. Ropes, lines, and all other appliances and devices used in connection with the fishing business of said parties, most of which items are situated upon the aforementioned premises or upon the beach adjacent thereto. We had a beach down by the river. So this is 1920, evidently.
Wow. And this one is signed by Peter Gagnon.
Yeah, well, he was one of the owners also. It just came down that way, that these different parties evidently didn't have the rig that long, because my father and his brother bought it in 1920. In consideration of the sum of $950 to him in hand, paid by Paul Taddy and William Taddy of Two Rivers. They must have bought it from a Louis Pulse. Whatever. I wish that I had got this stuff explained to me when my father was still living. But we found this in the desk. And he had a desk that they had bought when they were first married, and I've got it. And all that stuff was in there, along with some blonde curls of my sister who went to be a nun. She had real tight curly hair, and my mother must have cut them off and saved them, and they were in that desk.
Wow.
So there.